We are waiting for the technical people. I think they just ran out. පරිවර්තනය හැමෝටම අවශ්‍යය පාවිච්චි කරන්න මම හිතන්නේ ඒක වැඩ කරනවා කියලා මම හිතනවා. හරි මේ නැවත වතාවක් අපි මම ඊටාම කෙටියෙන් පැහැදිලි කරන අපි සාකච්ඡාව තුළ නැවත පැහැදිලි කිරීම කරයි. නමුත් මූලික වශයෙන් අද දවස් තුලත් අපි සාකච්ඡා කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ මේ වෙලාවේ විශේෂම අපි හැමෝම දන්න කාරණේ ලංකාව ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදලත් සමග ගිවිසුම්ගත වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒ ගිවිසුම්ගත විට ඇතුලේ මූලිකව සාකච්ඡා වෙච්ච කාරණේ තමයි ණය ප්‍රතිව්‍යුහගතකරණය. ඉතින් හුඟ දෙනේ මේ වචනේ පාවිච්චි කරාට ඇත්තටම ලංකාව ඇතුලේ මොකක්ද මේ වෙන්නේ කියන එක පිළිබඳ මහ ලොකු සාකච්ඡාවක් නැහැ. ඉතින් අපි අද උත්සාහ කරන්නේ ඇත්තටම මේ ණය ප්‍රතිව්‍යුහගතකරණය කියන්නේ කුමක්ද? ඒක ඇතුලේ මේ වෙලාවේ විශේෂයෙන්ම ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදල ඇතුලේ කොන්දේසි සහිතව ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න නියමිත මොනවාද? සහ ඒ සම්බන්ධයෙන් ලංකාවට ඒකෙන් ඇති වෙන බලපෑම කුමක්ද කියන එක පිළිබඳව ලංකාව ඇතුලේ වගේම ජාත්‍යන්තරව සිද්ධ වෙච්ච අත්දැකීම් සමග සාකච්ඡාවක් ගොඩනගා ගන්න තමයි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ. ඉතින් මේ සාකච්ඡාව ගොඩනගා ගැනීම සඳහා අපගේ කතිකයන් හඳුන්වා දීමටත් ඒ වගේම මේ සාකච්ඡාවේ පදනම පැහැදිලි කිරීමටත් මම ආරාධනා කරනවා යාපන විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයේ ජ්‍යෙෂ්ඨ කතිකාචාර්ය ආචාර්ය අහිලල් කදිරගම මහත්මයාට මේ සාකච්ඡාව ඉස්සරහට ගෙනියන්න කියලා.
Good morning to everyone, and welcome to this discussion on the IMF agreement, debt restructuring, and the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. First of all, I would like to thank the Law and Society Trust for organizing this discussion. As well as the International Development Economics Associates, an international network of economists mainly from the global south, from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, who have taken the time to come to Sri Lanka and have 3 days of discussions with us on the debt crisis in Sri Lanka, debt restructuring, and the recently brought out IMF agreement and its fallout. So the last 2 days, we've had 4 very productive sessions of discussions. In these discussions, a number of economists have both participated in person as well as online. The participants, the presentations were by, and would like to name them just so you know what has gone into what we are calling the Colombo Consultations on Debt Restructuring. Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, and I will, about the panelists, I will introduce them later. Mr. Bright Simmons, Professor Chandrasekhar from India, Mr. Bright Simmons from Ghana, Dr. Martin Guzman, who's a professor of public policy at Columbia University and the former Minister of Economy from Argentina. Dr. Ishaq Diwan, who is Director of Research at the Finance for Development Labs at the Paris School of Economics, and who's originally from Lebanon, so he has that experience as well. Dr. Jayati Ghosh, now with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and formerly longtime professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also with the Ideas Network. Then Ms. Yu-Fen Lee, and I will be introducing her later. Dr. Dotse Skata, who's a legal specialist on transnational law and formerly with the African Development Bank. And Dr. Charles Abugray from the Ideas Network. So a number of these economists made very important interventions, and it was in the spirit of brainstorming and thinking together, and we'll be bringing out the summary of proceedings, so you would be able to see that hopefully in the next week. And also we've decided to bring out a follow-up statement. You would have read a couple months ago a statement signed by 182 economists and academics on the IMF and Sri Lanka, and we plan to also bring that out. So it's been very productive sessions, and we thought it's useful to have a public meeting to have a discussion, both to say what we've been discussing, but also to address your questions. Now we all know that Sri Lanka is going through its worst economic crisis since independence. And while this crisis has many dimensions, one important aspect of it is that it's also a debt crisis. Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt external debt almost a year ago in August 2022. And this default, the debt crisis, and the way out of it through debt restructuring was the main focus of our discussions over the last 2 days. And when it comes to debt restructuring, in Sri Lanka, we have very little experience about it, and understandably so. This is the first time in our history that we have defaulted on our debt. And this is also true in many other countries, though some countries have had multiple defaults. So there's much that I think we need to learn, and learn very quickly, so that our creditors don't get the better of us and exploit us further. Now the economic crisis, the IMF agreement, the process of debt restructuring is also getting considerable attention globally, because Sri Lanka is seen as one of the first of possibly 50 or 70 countries, particularly in the global south, that are facing a tremendous stress in terms of their debt situation. Many of them could possibly default. So what happens in Sri Lanka is also being watched with much interest. So there is a global dimension to it. Now, while in Sri Lanka the main understanding of this debt crisis is that it was caused by corruption or economic mismanagement, while undeniably there is an element of corruption and economic mismanagement. But when you look at the global character of it, there is also a global political, economic, structural issue here that so many other countries are defaulting. It's not just about the leadership. I mean, we've seen in the Western world, we've seen the leadership of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, and so the leadership of the global order can be questioned as well. But what are the structural reasons for this debt crisis is something that we need to look for. And what are the lessons learned? Is the global economy on the cusp of change? A structural shift is something that we need to think about. When it comes to the debt and the default, first, in Sri Lanka, as in many other countries that have defaulted, there are big questions about, what do we have to do immediately? What kind of what we call a haircut, or how much should the creditors be asked to reduce in terms of the capital that we need to repay? Because having defaulted, what we don't want to see happen is that we say, okay, we've restructured our debt, we are going to pay them back, but it's not sustainable, and then we default again and again, which has happened in many other parts of the world. So we have to reduce our debt stock, and there has to be some fair and just way in which the risk of debt is also absorbed by the creditors. Now, the IMF agreement that was made public, their report on Monday, makes many recommendations that Sri Lanka should achieve a primary surplus next year. That's very soon. A primary surplus means that our revenue should be higher than our expenditure. Now, is this possible when Sri Lanka's primary deficit was about 5.3% in 2021, 3.8% in 2022? How can we, while our economy is collapsing, so quickly achieve a primary surplus? Can we generate that kind of revenues, or is it going to lead to further austerity and further contraction of the economy? What sort of growth should we be looking at? Arguably, our economy, starting with the COVID crisis, and last year, our economy shrunk by 8%. And if you include the last couple of years, last 3-4 years, almost by 20%. So a fifth of our economy has been lost. How are we going to recover? The growth projections in the IMF report, they say that this year again there'll be a 3% contraction, and they say then in the following years maybe 2 to 3% growth. Are we going to be able to recover with that kind of growth? So the question of growth becomes important. The question of inflation and what do we do about inflation? Do we fight inflation with this, we seem to have one big tool, and we seem to use the same tool regardless of what it is, and it's like using a hammer to solve all the problems in our economy, that is to increase interest rates. And interest rates, as you know, the central bank's policy rate is 16.5%. The bank lending rates are now between 25 to 30%, and we are seeing businesses collapse. Even the World Bank says last year 500,000 jobs were lost. Is that the way to move forward? Or is inflation something different, where it was a one-time price hike due to the devaluation of the rupee due to global commodity price increases, and how should we address that? Because wages have not increased. Last year we saw that food inflation almost doubled. The incomes of day wage laborers, on-skilled labor, was halved. So their incomes have halved and their food costs have doubled. So they have 1/4 as much money to pay for their food. And this is what we are seeing in terms of the tremendous suffering and levels of even starvation increasing in the country. So what do we do immediately is a question that we have to think about. But in our discussions, we also discussed what are the problems with the mechanisms globally available to address debt and debt restructuring. And we find that those mechanisms are really inadequate to address the problems not only in Sri Lanka, but in many parts of the world. So we need to, from the lessons in Sri Lanka, and we had a very strong presence from Africa in these consultations, very good papers and presentations which have enriched our thinking. Out of that, what kind of new mechanisms or what kind of changes in the mechanisms that exist are necessary to be able to this very widespread debt crisis in the country? And thirdly, is this a moment like the 1930s and 40s when the Bretton Woods institutions, in other words, the IMF and the World Bank were formed, a new financial architecture was created, or in the 1970s when the United States went off the gold standard, when the mandate of the IMF, whatever that might have been, takes a different turn towards structural adjustment? Is this a time for a new global financial architecture given the tremendous problems that we are facing? And those were also part of the discussion, and I think globally there's going to be increasing discussions along those lines of the need for a new global financial architecture. And I think from IDEA's point of view, IDEA's network, some of the discussions that we started here in Colombo, we hope to take to various international forums in terms of the need for such a new global financial architecture. And finally, we also spent considerable amount of time talking about the recent IMF agreement. Many new insights came to us through those discussions, and the panelists here will share some of that, but I just want to highlight a few of them in relation to Sri Lanka. Something that was new to us, pointed to us by Dr. Martin Guzman, the former economy minister of Argentina, who was part of similar negotiations, is that this IMF agreement is also the funds that we get, the loan that we get from the IMF, the interest that we are going to pay for it can be anywhere from 4 to 6.5%. Right? These are interest rates on the order of the extremely high sovereign bonds that we've been floating. So while Sri Lanka has very little foreign exchange, even for the loans that are given to supposedly stabilize us are extremely high interest costs that the people of this country are going to have to pay for. There was a lot of discussion that with the IMF agreement, while it will lead to difficulties for people, that there will be robust social protection, that there would be targeted cash transfers. Now, there's a lot of debate about what kind of social protection we need in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a long history of universal social welfare, free education, free healthcare, until the 1970s, of a universal food subsidy. And if we had that today, we won't be facing the kind of starvation that people are facing. But that was gotten rid of with the open economy reforms. So in that context, of course, there are questions about these targeted social transfers and particularly cash transfers, and what happens with inflation to those cash transfers. But even leaving that aside, if you look at the IMF report, they are allocating a mere 0.6% of our GDP for social protection. This is grossly inadequate. And this is what we've been told to wait for a year while our economy contracted by almost a tenth. So that's been a huge disappointment. We need to think about it. And lastly, the primary budget surplus that was mentioned, it seems unrealistic. It's going to bring about tremendous suffering, but even then unrealistic. There is also a lot of talk in the IMF agreement about state-owned enterprise reforms. In other words, privatization. So are we going to see in the next months and years a fire sale of our assets? And is that what's in the cards in terms of a country that has no bargaining power? This is the worst time to privatize, but is that how we are going to pay for both our imports in terms of address the balance of payment problems, as well as raise the revenues to show a primary surplus? So this is going to have long-term implications in terms of our economy, and I think we've already gone through considerable pain over the last year, and the next few years, I would say, there is going to be these dynamics, the fallout of this process, the IMF agreement and debt restructuring, that is going to change the trajectory, the social, economic, and political trajectory of our country. And all of these we have to be cognizant of. And I think the discussions that were started, hopefully the discussion today, would help us start thinking more and deeper about how we are going to address these concerns. So with that, I would like to introduce speakers, and there will be ample time for questions and discussion after that. We are going to start with Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, and then Dr. Charles Abugray, and then Ms. Yufen Lee. I will introduce all three speakers. Dr. C.P. Chandrasekhar was engaged in teaching and research at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and for more than 20 years, and is currently a research fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His areas of interest include the role of finance and industry in development, and the experience with fiscal, financial, and industrial policy reform in developing countries. I think all of us who read the economic literature know him for his columns and vast amount of writings. And then next after that, we'll have Mr. Charles Abugray, who is a Ghanaian development economist. He has worked as a researcher and lecturer and as an NGO activist and development professional in several parts of the world. He's currently the executive director of the International Development Economics Associates. That's the network that is one of the hosts of these discussions. He was previously the Africa Regional Director for the United Nations Millennium Campaign of UNDP and head of Christian Aid's Global Policy and Advocacy Division, and senior advisor to the President of Ghana on regional planning and development, and member of the National Development Planning Commission of Ghana. And then we have Ms. Yufen Lee, who was the former United Nations independent expert on debt and human rights. She's currently senior advisor on South-South cooperation and development finance at the South Center and co-chair of Debt Relief and Green Recovery Initiative. She headed the work on debt and development finance in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and was manager of UNCTAD project on promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing, and the manager of the project on globalization. She was a guest professor at the Tsinghua University in China. So we have a very distinguished panel. We are very fortunate to have their insights the last 2 days. And I'm very glad that we are able to have the opportunity to share their perspectives with you. So we will start with Dr. C.P. Chandrasekhar. Is it okay to speak from here, or should he go to the podium? Does it matter? Yeah, maybe the mic. Yeah.
Thank you, Ailan, and thanks to the Law and Society Trust for having invited us here, and to Ideas to participate in these discussions and in the consultation, and to have the opportunity to extend the discussion to a discussion with all of you. For an outsider coming into Sri Lanka now, having read about all of what had happened in terms of the protests, before the protests, the misery, the suffering, the difficulties, the protest, and then the long period of waiting after a government shift for actually some sign of resolution, there seems to be a sort of lull, a feeling that, aha, we've gone one step further. In some sense, we've managed something, and even the government is trying to present it as if signing this agreement with the International Monetary Fund is the beginning of a transition away from all of the difficulties which the accumulation of debt had created, accumulation of debt which had proved difficult to repay, resulting in the default in the April of 22. Now, I really want to very briefly look at whether there is cause enough at the current moment to, in some sense, hold back, to sit back, to think that now we will let the system and those who govern resolve the problems which the country faces, or if experience is any indication, are we really now in a long haul of struggle, which actually is going to necessitate possibly significant multiple rounds of protest and resistance in the days to come. Now, the reason I think we should think of this is that we should begin by being clear about, yes, sorry? Oh, is this okay? Yeah. So I think we should begin by recognizing that this is not a world, and by that I don't mean just Sri Lanka, but this is not a world in which, in some sense, there is a process in which difficulties are resolved among nations and governments which treat each other as equals, or between agents who actually have power which is on par with each other, that they are in fact we are not in a situation in which there exists some forces which are in the dominant pole of the international order, and some which, because of historical reasons, including, of course, colonialism, are at the subordinate pole of this order. Now, once we recognize that, we then need to say that if we actually look at this whole discussion, this whole debate which has occurred in recent times, which is not just a Sri Lankan problem, we know that there is debt is not something new for countries which have been at this subordinate pole or the losing end of global exchange, whether it is in terms of flows of capital or flows of goods and services. Debt has been a problem which has persisted. And of course, we had debt also in the developed industrial countries, but in particular, the kind of debt difficulties which have plagued the world have been something which has lasted virtually right through the period in which capitalist development produced inequalities worldwide. So then we should ask the question, is there something different in today's situation from one in which we've had large volumes of debt, particularly large volumes of debt which got accumulated in oil importing developing countries in the period after the 1970s, when we had two oil shocks and oil prices went up by more than 150%, resulting in a situation where suddenly countries found that in order to be able to meet even the minimum demands that they had in terms of energy consumption relative to the developed world, they had to outlay much larger volumes of foreign exchange, which required them to go and borrow, and therefore we began to see a certain acceleration in the accumulation of debt in the South or the global South or in the subordinate pole of the international order. So it's not really, we're not merely asking the question of whether there is something specific in the current conjuncture which is relative to, let's say, the history of an unequal world order as it evolved in the period since the Industrial Revolution. But we are also asking the question, is there something which is different today from the kind of problems which began to accumulate starting from the 1970s, in particular with the debt crisis in Latin America in the 1980s, which led up to what people said were the lost decades in Latin America, that development in some sense got completely held back in those countries with obvious implications for living standards of those who were without power within the domestic system. Now, in fact, there is a difference today, and the difference partly is, of course, reflected in the high degree of synchronization of the debt crisis. It's not Sri Lanka, it's Zambia, it's Chad, it's Ghana, it's Bolivia. I mean, there are so many countries now which are either debt stressed. We're talking about, something like 40, 50 countries across the world which are either debt stressed or on the verge of default or have defaulted on their debt. So this is not something, there's Pakistan, there's so many countries. So one aspect is, of course, that there seems to be a substantial degree of synchronization of the current crisis across the developing world. And part of the reason for that synchronization, of course, was the fact that the old problem exists, that is the absence of adequate diversification, economic diversification in these countries, basically meant that they couldn't earn too much from exports of their commodities and services. On the other hand, they had to be dependent on imports for a large volume of the commodities which they used in production and consumption. So you were import dependent because you didn't have diversification. You were not able to earn enough from exports, again, because of the absence of economic diversification. So it has been the case that therefore there's been a tendency for debt to accumulate. But there were barriers to the level of accumulation of debt. And in particular, the barrier which operated till the 1980s or so was the fact that you actually had flow of flow of foreign capital, either in the form of foreign investment or in the form of debt. But all of that debt essentially came through what's called the development aid network. It was either bilateral debt given by governments to governments in third world countries, or it was multilateral debt which came through agencies like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, etc. There was no private operator, with just a few exceptions, in terms of countries like South Korea, which had the benefit of an implicit sovereign guarantee of the United States because its development began under US occupation after the war with Japan. But other than for a very few, very, very rare examples, you didn't have the private sector providing any credit to developing countries because these countries were considered to be too risky. They were too risky because they were economically weak and therefore they might not be able to generate the surpluses to repay debt. They were too risky because of the fact that their currencies were extremely weak, and you can have a sudden depreciation of a currency, which meant that the burden in terms of local currency of repaying debt in foreign currency would keep on increasing, not because you're borrowing more but even just because of the fact that what you borrowed more, you need more, let us say, rupees in order to be able to service that dollar debt because of the depreciation of the rupee, whether it's the Sri Lankan rupee or the Indian rupee or whatever. So and finally, of course, there was this perception of a high degree of political risk that, these countries were politically unstable because they were poor, and therefore there was dissent, there was civil strife, which was periodically coming to the surface, and therefore you never know. You might get a government which comes up and says, listen, the previous government had borrowed all this money, we think that this is odious debt, and we don't see why we should be repaying you. So because of this perception of a high degree of risk of different kinds, the private capital market till the 1980s was unwilling to actually lend to or invest in instruments which were issued by developing countries. They were not even willing to do it even if you provided them with what's called a risk premium, where you offered them a higher interest rate, because virtually the perception seems to be that there is no premium which can actually manage to insure you against the kind of risk that you had when you lend to developing countries. Now, compared to that, if we look at the kind of debt which we are speaking of today, this synchronized crisis across the world, including, of course, in Sri Lanka, we know that a significant chunk of this debt comes from the private sector. It not merely comes from the commercial banks, the international commercial banking system, all of which started in the period after the 1970s, really, in 1980s, in fact, was when it accelerated. It also comes more recently in the form of the issue of sovereign bonds. Governments issued large volumes of sovereign bonds, not just in Sri Lanka, but in many other developing countries. Now, this tendency to borrow from the private market obviously gained some momentum in recent years for one major reason, and that major reason is a supply-side push of private capital into the developing world. Why was there a supply-side push? There was a supply-side push because of the fact that after the 2008 crisis, no rules apply to developed industrial country governments and developed industry country firms. So after the 2008 crisis, in countries which had always prescribed that you should only rely on the market and the state should not intervene too much, you had governments coming out and bailing out the financial system with large infusion of liquidity, both in terms of fiscal spending or government spending, but also in terms of the central bank taking over assets, toxic assets which were worthless in the hands of the banks, and providing them capital at par value as far as those bonds were concerned. So you actually had this huge infusion of liquidity, and this infusion of liquidity was occurring in a context in which those countries were actually going through the Great Recession, because that financial crisis, that North Atlantic financial crisis, precipitated a recession in those countries which lasted, well, more than a decade, and it was only just about beginning to sort of show some signs of recovery when we've been seeing the more recent trends in terms of inflation and rise in interest rates. So therefore, when you had this infusion of liquidity in a context in which the developed world is in recession, you needed to find new targets to lend to and invest in. And therefore, you not only had overcome, as a result of the surpluses which accumulated in the 1970s and 80s, partly because of the oil countries' surpluses being invested in the international banks, you now had a huge amount of surplus, which was virtually because, let's say, a country like the United States was pretending as if it had no budget constraint, and it was just treating what one leading economist said, was exploiting the fact that it had a mint in its backyard, because it could print dollars and spend dollars because anybody was willing to hold dollars, because the dollar is considered as good as gold in the current international order. That is the principal reserve currency. So you had this huge amount of liquidity. You needed to lend and invest in new locations. And therefore, you basically decided that you need to actually accelerate the degree to which you lent to and invested in developing countries. So, to refer to what Ahilan said, that it is true. It's not that there are governments in developing countries which are not profligate, which don't have a tendency to spend on prestige projects and so on. But the reason they can do it is because of the fact that the old barriers which existed before the 1980s don't exist in terms of the access to global finance. And more recently, the amount of global finance which was available at extremely low, thank you. at extremely low interest rates was huge. And therefore, country after country, when faced with difficulties in the balance of payments, began to borrow, and borrow in excess, if you want to call it that, and therefore got into a situation where the weakness on their balance of payments in terms of the inability to be able to generate the surpluses after their foreign exchange expenditures for imports, to be able to use that foreign exchange to repay debt, pay the interest and amortization on the debt that you take on, was actually under threat. Now, it was in that context that we saw the world being subjected to partly, I mean, they're not completely exogenous, because after all, you can't say that the COVID pandemic was completely exogenous. It also reflects the failure of the public health system globally. But the point is, we had the pandemic, which destroyed the foreign exchange earning capabilities. Tourism was destroyed, export earnings were gone, transportation, global transportation was at a standstill. So you actually could not earn money through exports. But that doesn't mean you have to reduce imports to zero, because some countries were dependent on food, most countries were dependent on fuel. So you could actually have a crisis where you have a shortage of food and fuel, but to the extent that you could get access to it, you did spend on that in foreign exchange. And then, of course, came the war in Ukraine. And it was not the war in Ukraine which led to a shortage of food and fuel which resulted in an increase in prices. Sensing that the war in Ukraine can be used as the basis for a speculative boom, speculators in global markets, large transnational corporations which operate in these markets, and firms like Glencore and others, speculated on the supply of these commodities, food and fuel, resulting in a sharp increase in prices, so that you were paying more even for the less that you were importing in the new context. And then we had, therefore, a situation in which this crisis was quite significant. You had to pay more for importing less. You were not earning any foreign exchange. You had built up this debt during a period in which interest rates were near zero, but capital was easily available. So you said, listen, if I can borrow at very low interest rates, what's wrong? Let me borrow at those low interest rates, undertake expenditures, generate growth. Some governments might have done it because they were corrupt, because they were profligate, whatever it is. But here was an opportunity. Who wouldn't use an opportunity? It was an opportunity created by global finance. So, so this has resulted in a situation where we ended up with, as I said, a synchronized crisis, because the shocks were global. The COVID pandemic was global. The effects of food and fuel price increases as a result of the Ukraine war was global. And therefore, you actually had not merely the global inequalities of countries located, affecting countries located at the subordinate pole of an unequal international order, you also had the situation that they were subjected to these shocks in a context in which they had borrowed large amounts because of the fact that there was this, the world was awash with liquidity, as people kept saying, at extremely low interest rates. Now, just to end, but so we therefore know that these countries now have three kinds of debt. They have debt which, like in the old days, comes from the multilateral system, from the World Bank, the ADB, etc. They have debt which comes bilaterally. Of course, the structure of that has changed because the old bilateral lenders, the old imperial powers, actually are suffering from aid fatigue and not doing very well. So increasingly, it's a rising country, namely China, which has been providing a significant amount of bilateral lending. And finally, of course, there's this large volume of private loans which have accumulated in the balance sheet. Now, if you look at that, and that's what underlies the crisis, where does the IMF enter the picture? I mean, why are we all talking about the IMF, waiting for an IMF loan, thinking that if the IMF comes, we've resolved our problem and we're going to go ahead? There must be some reason. In this unequal political economy, what's the role of this IMF? What has it given Sri Lanka? It's given Sri Lanka $2.9 billion over about 48-month period, isn't it? Yeah. And at an interest rate, as I mentioned, which is almost commercial. And you're talking about a country which has 50 billion or more of debt. So it's not giving you cheap money in large volumes to resolve your debt crisis. It's giving you a little pittance. What does it make you do to give you that little pittance? Firstly, it makes you wait. And what's the excuse to wait? I'm not going to give you this $2.9 billion unless all your other lenders agree to terms which we are going to set in terms of being able to resolve the debt problem which you face with them. So you must come to some kind of a restructuring agreement or arrangement with bilateral creditors, with multilateral creditors. Of course, you can't do it to start with private creditors. So let's leave the private creditors out. But at least, I mean, China is being intransigent. You know, it's not actually giving assurances that it will actually restructure debt and make it easy for you to repay. So that's the excuse which is given for the delay. But during this period of delay, what do we observe? That this entity, which actually is not an entity which is going to be the principal factor resolving your debt crisis in terms of access to finance, determines the policies that you're going to adopt. It's not merely that you say you go and restructure your debt, you say that you increase the prices of fuel. You say that, okay, you increase taxes, including indirect taxes in particular. Not too much said about things like wealth taxes and so on. You have to cut your subsidies or target these subsidies. You have to actually raise your interest rates because inflation is high. Why is inflation high? Inflation is high because your currency is depreciating, because food and fuel prices internationally are going up. But what do you have to do? You have to push up your interest rates to 16.5%. So it actually puts in place a set of policies which generates what we all refer to as stagflation. It's going to contract the economy even more, and it's going to generate even higher inflation because of the fact that you're going to have a period in which you're going to have more depreciation of the currency because of the uncertainties which prevail. Now, why does the IMF do this, and why does everybody listen to the IMF? It's because of the fact that in this global political economy, the IMF is the agency which is supposedly policing the world for global finance, for private global finance, not for China, not for India, to the extent that India is a lender, possibly in Sri Lanka, but not really, not possibly in Sri Lanka, but not really in many other parts of the world. It's actually not doing it in terms of saying that, it's not doing it for the World Bank, because the World Bank in any case is protected because it's a preferred creditor. You cannot default on debt which you take from the World Bank because you've signed into a treaty which makes you a member of that organization. So you're doing it for global private finance. And somehow the perception is that if you actually squeeze a country dry, you will release surpluses because they cannot import so much. You will reduce wages possibly and possibly increase exports. You will create a situation in which people take on precarious jobs for a pittance so that tourism can grow, etc. And you're hoping that engineering a shift in the distribution of income from the bottom of the pyramid to the top is actually going to allow you to actually suck out surpluses, which somehow can be transformed into foreign exchange to be paid to the private lenders. Well, just to conclude, experience all over the world, and that was discussed in the consultation, it's been written about, shows that this doesn't happen. That actually what therefore we have is, it's not only Sri Lanka which has gone through 15 IMF agreements and is now in accepted the 16th. Country after country has seen the recurrence of newer and newer debt crises in newer situations, because this is not something which is resolved in a permanent sense by dealing with the structural problems which underlie this weakness. It basically creates, it generates periods of time during which private capital can come back again and be in a position to earn its profits. Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Charles Abugray.
So once again, on behalf of IDS, I would like to express our appreciation to Law and Society Trusts, the hosts, Hilan, and all of those involved in organizing this. It's been a fascinating 2 days. This is the 3rd day. We learned a lot and we shared a lot. I would like to do 2 very quick things. The first is a very brief overview of the debt situation in the African continent, but it's very brief, just a context to say a couple of things. And the second is really to take a look at Ghana in the context of the Sri Lankan debt restructuring process. And the reason is that the two of them are quite similar in many respects. And some of the lessons of the Ghana restructuring struggles might be of some use to your struggles here. And then conclude with a couple of things in relation to the role of civil society going forward. So first, it's always difficult to generalize about the African continent because there are 53 countries of entirely different sizes, structures, cultures, and so on. But because we have over the years developed a continental entity called the African Union, we like to talk about the continent as a continent, while recognizing that there's a North Africa, there is a West Africa, and even within that West Africa, we have a Francophone part of the West Africa and an Anglophone part of West Africa. We have an East Africa with an entirely different shared history, but different history and historical relationships, and a Southern Africa with also entirely different historical, racial composition, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, we are a one continent with some shared characteristics. I just wanted to make the point that in the 1980s, 1990s, I mean, many of the countries decolonized only in the 1960s. And as Chandru was saying, between that period, 1960s and 1980s, we had a world order that suggested that developing countries can catch up if they industrialize. To industrialize, we needed to build our infrastructure, fiscal infrastructure, but also social infrastructure. So international financing architecture was heavily organized to support this. This is the period of development financing. So either FDI, you were encouraged to come in, public expenditure would help to drive overall aggregate demand, and then when you borrow from concessional sources largely. Now, already by the 1980s, early 1990s, many of them were in trouble debt-wise, and partly because, and mostly because, of changes in the international commodity market. So the first point I wanted to make is that now, as in the past, most of the African economy is caught in this commodity trap. So when there is a commodity boom, there is a pro-cyclical expenditure, the economy grows, it means and countries borrow more. And then when commodity prices collapse, they are left to hold the pieces. Most commodity dependency, especially the ones with the worst impacts, are not only agricultural commodities, but mineral extraction. And so in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, the continent went through a major restructuring, IMF-led restructuring process. But in that time, there was still the international world order was still sympathetic to the idea of debt reduction. And this is how the HIPC and the multilateral debt relief initiative came in. And so many of the countries, after very painful adjustment processes, did manage to get rid of a lot of that debt, and it was largely official debt. Just like, to repeat the point that Chandru was making. And so by the early 2010s, many of these countries had quite a bit of space to borrow some more, and also to spend domestically. Now, the expectations then from the adjustment period there was that it was a badge of honor to move rapidly away from dependence on official development assistance to entering the market. And so from 2010, much of the continent many of them having rebased their GDP. That means they raised their GDP levels, largely because of three factors: a new renewed commodity boom, but also the entry into the African development scene by China. And so, as a result, economies started to grow and made it even more attractive to borrow, and they started to binge this time on international private bonds. And so within a period of 10 years, even just 8 low middle income countries managed to issue up to 100 bonds, most of them short term to medium, only about 4 of them over 20 years, at interest rates initially around 7%, and at a later time, a country like Ghana was issuing bonds at close to 30% coupon rates. And that started to repeat itself. So, and so, just like Sri Lanka, Ghana became the debt profile of Ghana became fundamentally changed, in which a large proportion of the debt portfolio is debt owed largely to the Eurobond market, issued at the Eurobond market. And so many of the countries, so we have on the continent nearly 14 countries at a high risk of debt default, and even more at a moderate rate of debt default, and the default risks are increasing across the continent. And I wanted to make the point that the driver for this debt distress is not so much domestic expenditure, because many of them have very low expenditure to the GDP rates over many periods. Only Ghana has been stubborn. Ghana, Zimbabwe, and Kenya have been stubborn, even throughout the period of structural adjustment, to maintain a budget deficit levels higher than 5 to 6% for many years. But it's also one of the reasons why the Ghana and Kenya and later on Ethiopia became the success stories of the adjustment. And this is partly because public expenditure was maintained, but also that there was an attraction of investment largely from China and others into the infrastructure area. So now we have a situation where Ghana, like Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, defaulted on its debt. Started with its external debt. It can no more pay. It issued a bond for 35%, and nobody patronized that bond. So it was clear that it had come to the end of the road on this. The credit rating agencies basically rated it as junk, and so that brought a screeching halt to the private capital market binge in Ghana. So what has happened, and why is it so similar to Sri Lanka? First, as I said, a similar structure of debt. 40 to 50% of debt, the sovereign debt, is owed to private capital markets, mainly the Eurobond market. The second is that they defaulted just about the same time. And thirdly, they applied to go to the IMF also just about the same time. Sri Lanka has an agreement. Ghana only has a staff level agreement. But that staff level agreement, which is not made public in Ghana, but in many ways, as a result of the steps being taken by the Ghanaian government in preparation as part of the steps towards a board agreement, suggests the things that might be in the staff level agreement. One of the key steps that we have taken is a radical domestic bond market restructuring. Now, this is important for Sri Lanka because some of the Sri Lankan board papers suggest that the government of Sri Lanka is open to undertaking a domestic bond restructuring. How has that happened in Ghana? So the government of Ghana is doing this unilaterally with very limited consultation. They are exchanging current government paper, especially bonds, for new ones that extend the term and reduce the yield. And thirdly, postpone the servicing. Now, the domestic bond market is a complex structure which each of us need to understand. Some of these bonds are held mostly by the banks. So depending on the structure of your banks, whether they are foreign or domestic, the political economy implications are different. Some of the bonds are held by pension funds. So in the case of Ghana, it's a major, one of our biggest forced long-term savings instrument are pension funds and social security savings. Social security, but also insurance savings. So the local insurance industry and the pension funds are also caught up in that restructuring. And then you have individual holders. Many of them are also pensioners. Some may have worked abroad, some work domestically, brought their capital, and bought government paper. In the whole for two reasons. Either that they are investing so they can get a flow of income, or that some of them for patriotic reasons to support national investment. So they are all in trouble, one way or the other. So that domestic debt restructuring process is generating a lot of tension in Ghana. Now, the IMF says in a policy paper that countries should actually try and avoid domestic debt restructuring if you can. And they compare it to a brutal surgery. And you only do a surgery when there's no other way of treating yourself. Because when you cut yourself up, you create other problems that are difficult that then generate other new problems. So you want to avoid being cut up. So they say so. And there are a number of reasons in their paper that they have explained. One of it is that, well, your banks will take a hit. So when your banks take a hit, it means that there will be a direct and indirect impact on the ability of the economy to grow. So because credit will reduce. Secondly, when they take a hit, in order for them not to collapse, they have to be recapitalized. And somebody has to pay for that recapitalization process. That's the taxpayer. So you have an expensive process to save your banks from collapsing. And then the third is that it really damages any trust in the government instruments. And how does government finance development if the people rebel and refuse to buy any more government paper? And so on and so forth. Now I raise a few because you can do your own analysis of the implication of a domestic debt restructuring. When it becomes totally necessary to do it, there are lessons to draw from. A colleague of ours who was making a presentation was giving us a couple of examples. So one of the so-called successful example is Jamaica. But in the Jamaican case, it took a lot of civil society consultation and involvement and an engagement between the citizens and the state on the basis of transparency to monitor where government expenditure actually goes when you do this major restructuring, but also to ensure that debt reduction does not lead or increase domestic inequalities and inequities. Without that strong civil society engagement with the state and a transparent attitude of the state, the tendency would be that the burden sharing will be inequitable, that the elite will take their resources out, that there will be fire sales of public assets, and that there will be major damage to workers' savings. Therefore, it is possible, but there's conditions. If we can avoid it, we avoid it. In the Ghanaian case, we have had individual bondholders organize and protest, so they have been removed. Workers organize and protest, and they have been removed. And others are also organizing and protesting. The banks can't quite protest because regulatory pressure will bring to bear on them. But the implications is that the even very limited lending by the banks will become even more limited, even for trade financing in the future, with the potential that a recession, a long-term recession is possible, and the pathway to actual debt reduction is not beyond this domestic debt restructuring. It's not clear because the external part of the restructuring, just like Chandru said, which requires bringing together a lot of private and creditors of all sorts, coordinating that. That coordinating mechanism is weak. There is no compulsion mechanism for them to restructure, and the IMF is doing very little and have very little ability to influence this. So the last message is avoid it if you can. If you cannot, then you have to be part of the process of doing this systematically and deliberately. Thank you.
Ms. Yufen Lee, please.
Good morning, everyone. I would like also to thank the organizers, the ideas, and also the Law and Society Trust, as well as the Open Society Fund for organizing this event and also for inviting me here. This is my first time to come to Sri Lanka. My job used to be in the United Nations, so I've traveled quite extensively. I must say that the few days I'm here, I fall in love in this country. I think Sri Lanka has a lot to offer. I'm very pleased to see you all here today because today is the weekend and you still want to listen to what is going on with the debt restructuring in the country. I think it is very important. When I landed here from the airport, the hotel sent a chauffeur to pick me up, and the chauffeur was very happy to tell me that we are okay now, we have IMF with us. I think this is the wrong kind of concept and understanding. This is just the start. You have a lot suffering to go, and the citizens, ordinary people, should know where you stand, what you are going to do, and what kind of role you can play, because the citizens, the population of the country, do have a role to play. For instance, for the IMF bridge financing, it will cover 4 years, and it will have a 6-month review 8 times. So each time, if the IMF would say that you have not done your job, you will not have your money to be paid. And the money is not a huge amount. It's 330 million each time. So the IMF has kept you on short leash. However, if the IMF is going to say, I'm not going to pay you because you have not fulfilled your obligations, and then internationally, you would have very bad opinion from the investors. You certainly won't have access to borrow from the international market. So you have to be vigilant and you have to play a role in the entire process. Now, where we stand with the IMF restructuring, the IMF's role, we know that your government announced default in April last year, and very quickly in May, the government employed the legal and finance advisors to advise on how to do this restructuring job. Of course, this will cost the government. And then in September last year, the IMF has reached the staff level agreement. However, your government immediately started to implement the IMF program. That's something quite unusual because you implement it very fast. And then the government reached out to bilateral creditors, which constitute about 14% of the total debt. Not a huge amount, but you need to get the assurances from these bilateral creditors in order for the IMF to agree to have a program and also release bridging finance. So the government got that. And then just a couple of days ago, you got the first installment of money. But that's just the start of the implementation of the program. You still have a lot to do because the private investors covers a huge amount, and you haven't reached there yet. Chandra just now mentioned how come Sri Lanka has landed in the current position. We know you are deeply in debt, 80 billion US dollars in total, and half of it is domestic. And multilateral debt is about 14%. There are push factors, as Chandra explained very clearly and very well to you, because there is a slush of liquidity floating around the world. And in the advanced countries, the interest rate was negative or very low. So the investors want to gain some money. So they are very eager. They have been very eager to lend money to the developing countries at about 6 or 7 or 8%. So it depends on the yield. But they are earning good money. If they park the money in their own country, they don't earn anything. If they lend money to Sri Lanka, they do earn this 7 to 8%. So it's to their benefit. So this is the push factor for lending, for many countries, many developing countries to fall into debt distress. Currently, we've done a recent study and we've counted, and there are about 68 developing countries either in debt distress or high risk of debt distress, which means quite a number of countries would follow suit, follow Sri Lanka to declare default. However, there is also the pull factor for Sri Lanka. Because for Sri Lanka, for many years, for decades, you've been suffering from fiscal deficit and also balance of payment deficit. So the government did not have enough money to cover this. However, the government would like to really muddle through, so the government started to borrow massively. So you floated the first bond in 2007, $100 million, not huge, at 7%, is reasonable. And then 2 years after, you floated another, the second bond, about the same size, about the same percentage of interest rate. And then this started, this push factor, and also your problems are getting worse, and you have less money. I mean, the government had less money to cover the expenditure. So between 2015 and 2019, the government floated 1 year a bond each year, and 2019, 2 bonds. But the size is getting much bigger. It's 2.5 billion almost each time. So altogether, you accumulated 12 billion US dollars. So you are having a kind of binge, yeah, borrowing binge. However, you have to service the debt. And there are external shocks mentioned by Chandra and also Charles. And I don't need to mention that. All of you know the kind of external factors, COVID, Ukraine, and also the increase of interest rates in the United States and other advanced countries. So there are various kinds of external shocks in the world. So the rollover, or in normal terms, if you have a mortgage, you have to pay principal and interest. So for your country, each year you have to pay to service debt about 4 billion US dollars. Now we come to the IMF funding, bridge funding. It is 2.9 billion US dollars. Yeah? The arrears you accumulated in 1 year, starting from you declaring default, was more than the IMF financing. And also, it was mentioned about the interest rates to be charged. You know, normally, the IMF would give low-income countries concessional interest rate or even grants. However, Sri Lanka now is a middle-income country, so you have to pay higher interest rate because you've lost this status of access to concessional financing, and you lost the kind of technical support to the low-income countries. So the government has not adjusted to that. So what are the challenges you are facing with this debt restructuring? The Sri Lanka government has gone into IMF in the past 16 times. However, it was not for debt restructuring. This 17th time for you to enter into an IMF program is for debt restructuring. It's the first time. So the governments, experts, academia, they don't really know how to handle debt restructuring. So first of all, you have to learn what to do and how to do it. For instance, for Argentina, they can do it well because they had quite a number of defaults. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is it is happening at a very bad time. You've heard about this bank collapse, that bank collapsed in the US and in Switzerland, where I come from. So now you have a lot of financial market volatility in the world. Interest rate is high, and domestically, you have no money. Your foreign exchange reserve depleted, and your tourism, which is a major sector in your economy, has just started to pick up. So in the past, the money you borrowed, much of it have not been invested in the industrial or growth promotion sectors to create money, to create revenue and foreign exchange for you to service debt. So you are actually, the country has been living beyond its means. So that's the difficulty. If you have a solid, in economic terms, we said if you have solid economic fundamentals, of course, first of all, you won't fall into debt crisis. And secondly, you know, if you have a better foundation, you can better handle debt restructuring, but you don't have that. And another factor is that you have a lot of private sector borrowing. I mentioned about the bonds that you floated. You are dealing with millions of private creditors. And for the private creditors, their first instinct is, I won't accept any haircut, we call haircut, which means that you reduce, if you have a mortgage, you reduce the principals. Yeah, that's the haircut. And they don't want to have maturity extension or coupon adjustment, that is interest rate, they adjust. So they don't want to have it. I invest, I want to have money, I want to earn money. However, in the current world, we are living in a non-system world for debt restructuring. There is no mechanism that can govern this kind of debt restructuring. So the private sectors can say, I don't want to participate. The principle is, when it comes to debt restructuring, it's very clear. The cornerstone is all creditors should be treated equal. If the official bilateral creditors accept certain terms, the private creditors must accept similar comparable terms. But they won't do it. Not only they don't like to do it, there are no incentives or kind of punitive measures to force them to do it. And the worst thing is, these creditors, big ones, not individuals in the pension funds, the big financial institutions like hedge funds, they can bring your government to court. And currently, there is one bank which is suing Sri Lanka, and in the New York Federal Court, already brought your government to the court to say, you must pay my bond in 100% term. So now the government is hiring people to fight this case, and this is going to be costly. So, of course, there are various kinds of measures the governments can use for domestic creditors. So if you have the major countries, they use their own political will to force, probably you can place some influence on this, but it's very difficult. So this private sector participation, you haven't started yet, not even the little bit. Yeah. So this is going to be a major challenge. Another thing is that there will be austerity. That is, people will suffer. So the chauffeur told me on the road, he's very talkative. He said, the price of the bread, comparing before COVID to now, increased 4 times, which means that daily consumption products or items for ordinary people, the inflation rate is much higher than the average inflation rate, 70% or whatever. It changes all the time. So with this IMF program, they ask you to change, just like it was mentioned, to say that the primary balance has to be changed from deficit in 2 years' time. By 2025, it has to be in surplus. How do you do that? You need either have sufficient liquidity to flow in to support you, which you don't have, because you are already a middle income country. You are treated like that, and you are not given good terms for this financing from the IMF. And domestically, the recovery of various industries will not be that fast. So, what else to do? You have to cut expenditure, cut wages, and the IMF said that you should not reduce the social spending. But how can you do that? How can you do it? So it is something to say, in principle, people should not really suffer, but actually, I'm requesting you to do it. So, ordinary people have to prepare for hard life, for hard days, and it will not be just 1 year. Very likely, it will be several years or even longer. Latin American countries, when they went through that restructuring, they talked about the lost decade. So you have to prepare for hard life for several years to 10 years or longer. So in between, you have to make your voice heard about your suffering, about what you wish the government to do, what you expect the international community to do. So by getting your voice heard, you might change the policies to a certain extent. There are also other options in addition to people. You could think about innovative financing. For instance, now the World Bank has reversed your status back to the low-income countries. So try to get concessional financing. And the other countries, small island countries like Barbados, they have used such instruments like debt for climate change, swap or transfer or whatever you call that, which means they make up a climate change adaptation plan, environmental protection plan, in return for some money from IMF or other regional banks. You could do the same because you have blue economy, you have the ocean, Indian Ocean, you also have the green economy. And you can also have nature to debt swap. And also you have a lot of diaspora living abroad. You can think about, it takes time. It will not happen tomorrow. For the preparation for a diaspora bond, it will take quite some time to prepare. You have to have road shows, to do a lot of things. You can think about that. And also think about how to encourage remittances, which is about 8.8 or higher percentage of your GDP. So try to simplify the process, try to raise the awareness of your diaspora and ask them to remit more money, and then turn this money into investment and try to have a virtuous circle. So money put in productive things and getting more money. So you have to think all kinds of innovative ways to bring more money and to bring more investment. So I wish you all good luck, and also try our best to influence the policy decision process, and also try to get your voice heard domestically and also internationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Chandru, Charles, and Yufen. So now we will move into the Q&A part. I think there should be a FM mic in the back, and if you can bring that. So just to, as you are thinking of your questions, just to at least summarize a few of the points. I mean, it is a dismal picture. We are looking at possibly a lost decade, and how we are going to deal with that. But and we've seen this in the past in other regions. They've also pointed out both the structural problems in the global system as well as its susceptibility to different kinds of shocks. And we might, even in the years ahead, see new kinds of shocks. So the IMF agreement and the report, if you look at it, it makes many assumptions. but it's not going to be, even if it works according to their formula, it's not going to be such a smooth picture. Charles pointed out, and Yufen pointed out to the way in which bondholders might hold out. This debt restructuring process that is just getting started, in some places it's taken years. So it can drag on because the bondholders want every pound of flesh, so to speak. And they might hold out even as our international financial transactions are put on hold. Then there is the real dangers that are inherent to domestic debt restructuring. How it can cause a banking crisis locally, all kinds of other problems for our EPF, ETF funds that are invested. So there are many other dangers if we go that route, and I think it's important that the public are very vigilant about the dangers of a domestic debt restructuring process. At the heart of all of this is the future of development financing. With interest rates so high, how are countries like Sri Lanka going to continue with development? As I mentioned, our economies have shrunk. What is going to be the future of investment, not only in terms of the infrastructure that we need for growth, but also our social infrastructure? So we really need to think about where we are going to get development financing and how we are going to use that development financing. And I think at the heart of this is, what's sad about Sri Lanka is that we've surrendered to this rule of experts, the IMF, assuming that somehow they are going to solve our problem. But I think all three panelists, what they are saying is the importance of public participation, that this way forward, not only politically, but even economically, has to be democratic. And both inside our country, that kind of public participation to keep our authorities in check if there's the danger of a fire sale of assets, if social welfare as we've known it, we're going to lose it. But also globally, because this is a global problem, how do we keep these, for lack of a better word, global parasites in check? Otherwise, they are going to extract and continue to extract. And is it possible, one of the ideas that came from our discussions that Chandru put forward is the need for a coalition of debtor nations to be able to put forward some alternatives. Because as one country, we have no negotiating power. But there are 50 to 70 countries facing these kinds of problems. And we need South-South cooperation. And to be able to put forward a common voice to address the new global financial architecture or the new form of development financing that's necessary. So I think there's a lot to think about, but I'm sure you have a lot of questions and possibly comments, so we'll open it up and we'll collect a number of questions and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. So if you can please raise your hand, then and then I think, shall we start with, no, we'll start with, yeah, we'll come to you in a bit, Sakuntala. Yeah.
My question, thank you for the very insightful speeches, first of all. My question is, any one of you can answer. I was just wondering, when we get the IMF support, do they prescribe us on the spending? Because I heard that half of the money that we got is used to pay back the Indian credit line. Yesterday, the news recorded that. And how do we prioritize? Is that entirely the government's decision? I'm not really sure, so I'm just wondering how it is being spent and who decides the priorities. Thank you. Sakuntala.
This is a question to Chandru. I was wondering, will this coalition of debtors, do you envisage it coming from the government or from civil society? I was just thinking that our governments are also quite unstable at the moment. I mean, take a country like Pakistan. You don't know who's going to be in charge. Likewise in Sri Lanka. There's also, they are in a race to appease the creditors. So I can't see that imagination coming from the governments. And do you think there's a role for civil society to do that?
I have two questions. One is if it is possible to clarify a little bit more about how the banks are going to get a hit. Because at the moment, like people keep saying, the banks are making money, they are able to give all these interest rates. So are the banks going to kind of collapse? And is that going to be more with the Sri Lankan banks as opposed to a foreign bank like HSBC? So that's one question. And the other question is, I was really interested in how Sri Lanka can access loans for green projects. Is that like a loan that has to be paid, or is it like, you know, you have this green credit, like you grow something green and that becomes like a credit? So yeah, basically to clarify if it is a loan, what kind of interest, and how will that actually work? Thank you.
There's a question in the back. Anybody in the back?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the space and the insights that have been shared. As part of the IMF's proposed prior actions and structural benchmarks, one of the things is the rollout of the ITMIS as well as an appropriation bill. I wasn't able to find more detail into what those were. Does anyone on the panel have any idea? Thank you.
Can you repeat that, please? ITMIS
rollout, as well as an appropriation bill.
ITMI is possibly that's just a management information system, so that you can monitor, you know, whether you're actually meeting the conditions which the IMF has set. So I think that must be.
Okay, the abbreviation wasn't specified. That's all. Thank you.
My question to the panel is about social protection. We know that people are currently suffering and this will continue in the time to come. Ahilan did mention that the IMF has proposed an inadequate amount of the GDP for social protection. So I want to know, like, what's the ideal approximate amount of the GDP that we should campaign for in terms of making allocations for social protection? And my second question is about the new global financial architecture that was suggested. If you could clarify as to what this really means and how it will benefit us, that would be great.
I just have two questions. One is we keep talking about civil society engagement, particularly with in debt restructuring as well as engagement with the IMF. But the engagement with civil society and trade unions, which IMF had before this, has been very, if states find it hard to negotiate with creditors and the IMF, civil society negotiating, unless we have a strategy, there is a huge power dynamics and it's not going to work. So is there any particular example from any other country where civil society, trade unions, citizens have successfully engaged when a IMF deal had come into a country? So that's one thing. And the second question, so I wanted something, if there is some example or something which we can, learn from. The other thing is about green bonds. So this has been discussed even before in Sri Lanka in terms of converting these financial bonds to green bonds. But I have been quite worried about how these green bonds have been promoted and what that does in terms of resources in developing worlds and how that affects resources, because it's promoted as something sustainable and something as an alternative to as a sustainable development process. But I have been very worried about how that affects local resources and how it affects local populations in terms of what these green bonds does. So maybe if someone can explain in the panel what these green bonds are and whether it is actually an alternative to the current financial order we have. Thank you.
Okay, shall we take these? Oh, sorry.
Ultimately, the taxpayers are going to bear the brunt of paying back this loan. What mechanisms are in place to monitor and watch the government and all these international players who are going to be manipulating all this? Is there any ombudsman or some person or persons who will watch what's going on?
Yeah. So we'll go the other. Yufen, would you like to start with the questions? You have to put your mic on.
I have to think what to go first. Some people are. I did already. Okay. First of all, someone asked questions about these collapsing banks in the West, right? Here. Okay. The banks, I think right now for the domestic debt, right now the decision is still pending. Actually, what the IMF proposed was to give the government 2 tranches for the payment out of this $2.9 billion US dollars. But the government said they would like to decide on the parameter and the package of debt restructuring by the end of April, which means what debt will be restructured? It has not been decided yet. However, in the IMF staff paper, it said the preference of the government is to selectively reprofile some of the debt owned by the banks. To reprofiling means to extend the maturity of the debt owned by the local banks. Of course, that would be alleviating the burden of the central government. The banks would suffer a little bit, but it will not really, from my point of view, my understanding, I think it should not collapse the banks. First of all, we know the banks have already suffered, and we also know that the domestic debt, not the same as external debt, has already suffered haircuts because of your high inflation and also because of the currency massive depreciation. So the debt is becoming smaller for domestic banks and other entities. So when we talk about dealing with debt problem, very often the first choice given is you inflate away the debt. However, the Sri Lanka debt is so huge, you cannot really inflate away, which means the banks have already suffered haircut for the debt. The debt is smaller. What is going to do next? The government is trying to balance not to affect the financial stability within the country, because that will be counterproductive, and the government will have to recapitalize those banks. So what to do next is to be decided. And of course, you have money deposited there, so your views should also be listened to, right? So that's one thing. About the green financing, the views is like this. For instance, IMF and regional banks and UN system, they all have this kind of green products. What they do is that the governments would propose certain projects and also have kind of national strategy about climate change adaptation and also environmental protection. In return, they will get certain amount of money or for certain, Seychelles had this debt to nature swap. It's not an easy process, but there was precedence. However, for the financing instruments I mentioned just now, the interest rate, the terms are concessional. And much of it also have grace period, which means for a certain number of years, you don't have to pay back, which is good for Sri Lanka. But for green bonds, it's a complicated process. And now some African governments are thinking about that. I have a friend who is helping the Kenyan government to float the first green bond. It takes a lot of efforts to the design of it, the preparation of it. First of all, you have to set aside a couple of $1 million in order to get this prepared. But the payback will be much larger than the couple of millions you are talking, I've been talking about. Of course, you would have road shows and publicize and all that. You need to have people, professionals, to help you to set up this kind of green bonds. And also, it will take about 16 to 18 months for get it done. So it's not money immediately you can tap into, but you can start to think about that already, because we are not expecting that Sri Lanka will solve the problems within 2 years. So I think you can start to think about and make preparation and do something. Let me just first cover these two, and we have experts who are very capable to answer the rest of questions. Thank you.
So let me take the bank's question first, just build on that. So I was drawing on the Ghana case in which the domestic debt restructuring affects the banks directly. They will miss any payments for you know, the interest payments for 2023 completely, and the bond term would be extended, meaning basically you lose some flows. And what that then means is that the smaller banks with very limited capital adequacy base will be in trouble. So somebody has to help recapitalize them if it goes that way in Sri Lanka. In the interim, apart from the fact that they have already lost value in foreign exchange terms, in exchange rate comparative terms, because of the inflation and the exchange rate depreciation, it will, I haven't looked at the monetary policy in the program, will probably require that domestic interest rates also rise, or that domestic interest will rise anyway because of the cost of borrowing internationally anyway. That means that there would be a direct impact on the volume of lending and the returns from lending, even if they do not take the haircut as in the Ghana case. I think the principal point here is to know what, if the government of Sri Lanka is going down the road of debt restructuring, what is intended. And that makes the point about the transparency question, the participation questions, and the consultation questions of different potential stakeholders in the domestic debt restructuring process, to be able to know what the potential cost would be, what types of banks will be more impacted than others, and what types of stakeholders are likely to be more impacted than others. But as Yofin says, they may not go down the road of a major bank bond restructuring and so on. But that's to find out. The issue of coalition of creditors, I'm sure Chandru will take a lot of it, but I see it in two parts. So there is already quite an active global civil society coalitions on debt. I'm sure that there are organizations in Sri Lanka involved in this. Otherwise, international solidarity is important, that collective voice to engage the international system, like the cost of borrowing from the IMF, for example, that's been discussed. The IMF enriching itself on the back of countries suffering. Those are things civil society can say straight and crude in their engagement with these institutions, more than probably governments can do, and can back up governments in this quest to transform the way the international financial actors act, in the interest of developing countries collectively. And when we get back home, we can quarrel about democracy and so on. But at that international level, that global civil society collective voice is very important. And I think what is being organized in Sri Lanka here ought to try to engage more in that global collective. But there is another part, which is that if governments speak together in the spaces where it is governments that are on the table for negotiation and for policy setting, it certainly makes it easier to make some of the reforms in the institutions. But that, of course, requires some kind of progressive government with an internationalist perspective. And so it needs those political spaces, people who can take the lead in the way that the 50s, 60s, early 70s had a number of key government leaders. It may well be that entities like BRICS might eventually become a useful forum also, even if the smaller countries like Sri Lanka are not members of BRICS, but it's definitely a potential entry point for a voice of the countries in debt restructuring. So we have to think about those of us who are connected to government and so on and so forth, see how to encourage some government to government coming together. My final point is on, is there a mechanism to complain and to watch what the IMF and the World Bank do in our countries? There are clear complaints mechanisms in the World Bank and in the IMF also, meaning that we can take formal complaints. I know the process is slow and so on and so forth, but I think for matters of structural policy and principle, we can, if we are properly organized. But it does require that we do our homework, which means we know more, we research more, we frame our asks more, and we record more the experiences of ordinary people and the things we are complaining about, and so on and so forth. So it means investing a bit more in our homework here and in our individual countries to be able to take these complaints up.
Can I say?
We need to watch the government also.
Yes.
I think back to the tsunami money and how it was misappropriated.
I just say one sentence. I just say one sentence about which NGO you can contact. In the Philippines, there is a famous NGO, Debt Auditing, and they are being listened to by the parliament. I can give you the contacts of the Philippines, and internationally, they also have their voice. Thank you.
Yeah, well, quickly first, a couple of things. There was a question about whether the IMF can prescribe how to use the money it gives. Two things. One is, unlike the money you get from, let's say, the World Bank, other multilaterals, which actually give money for, which is development finance, they're linked to projects. So therefore, because they're linked to projects, you put up a project proposal, they place some conditions, and therefore it's linked, it's tied to those projects in substantial measure. IMF lending is emergency balance of payments finance. It's not really, I wouldn't even say it's budgetary funding. In practice, it's free to be used the way you want, but it's small money. It's bridge finance to deal with the balance of payments problem such that you can actually resolve the balance of payments difficulty. It's not like giving you money to undertake larger expenditures or finance particular projects. About this coalition of the debtors, finally, let me put it this way. Finally, governments have to negotiate. Civil society cannot sit down and negotiate. Civil society can have other rules, but governments have to negotiate. So what is the role of civil society then? What we have in today's world is that all of us know IMF has a clear template. Independent of the size of the country, level of development, degree of structural diversification, it's the same template. If you want money from the IMF, if you exceed a certain tranche level, you have to implement these conditions, and the conditions, whether it is Nepal or it is India or whether it is Sri Lanka or whether it's Pakistan or it's Bolivia, it's. So the point is, and we know that template is both regressive in terms of its income distribution effects, and it is also something which is contractionary. It doesn't actually suit growth. So the first thing we need an alternative template. Not that we don't have, versions of it, but we need actually to emphasize that there exists an alternative template to deal with situations of balance payments difficulty. Now, in generating that template, of course, civil society can play an important role. So say that, you have consultations, not within your own country, you have global consultations to say that, listen, we think that this is the template which is actually not regressive and could facilitate growth along with the adjustment of the balance of payments. Now, if you do that, then the next stage is you must be able to get your government to use that template when it goes to negotiate. That is, it must not say that, listen, I only hope the IMF will come and give me money. That is, you're not even discussing the IMF's conditionality. You want the IMF to come because you think that the IMF is a savior in a situation of difficulty, whereas actually what's happening is that it's imposing this template on you. So to pressure the government to actually adopt this template, civil society needs to act at the national level, and at the international level, it must try and act to actually change the attitude of institutions of which all countries are members. Of course, the voting strengths differ. The United States has a veto by virtue of its, whatever, 18% or whatever it is shareholding. But you need, at the international level, to say that, listen, this is part of an international understanding of how to deal with global balance of payments. So your governance should change. And in fact, there's a lot of discussion of that. There's the Bridgetown initiative, Mia Motley and others who put forward some way of reforming the international architecture. And domestically, you're going to put pressure on governments to say that, please, you all come together and use this template. Because if Sri Lanka alone says that I want this, you're not going to get it. But if all developing countries which are going to default, there's so much of debt which is there in these countries that if a bunch of developing countries together say that, no, I'm not bothered, I'm going to default because anyway, this is not going to help me, that will collapse the banking system in the metropolitan countries. Because they have put a large amount of money, it will also affect the financial system because there are all these institutions which have invested in these sovereign bonds. So you use, I mean, that old thing, if you owe a bank 100 rupees, then it's your problem. But if you owe a bank 1,000,000 rupees, then it's the bank's problem. So if you come together, you also have a certain weightage in terms of being able to influence but the point is you must get governments to accept and then sit together, independent of the G20. Because, we keep talking about the G20 common framework. But there is one entity which doesn't go along with this common framework. This is a very uncommon entity, which is the IMF. Because it's, anyway, the G20 itself has countries at different levels of development. So that's the way I'd take it. Just a quick thing on banks taking a hit. There are two issues here. One is when you restructure debt, to the extent that bonds are major holders of, let us say, government securities. If you restructure government debt by replacing one bunch of debt with another bunch of debt with an implicit haircut because you're extending the terms of payment as well as changing the interest rate, the bank is going to take a loss. But in addition to that, we are in a world where, in a context of rising inflation, the principal instrument which is used, partly under pressure from agencies like the IMF, is interest rate increases. Now, when interest rates go up, bond prices come down. So banks will also, that's what happened to Credit Suisse, that's what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. You basically are in a situation in which the value of the bonds you hold go down for reasons other than the restructuring. So you put this together, because they come together in context like this. I mean, Sri Lankan interest rate is now 16%. You could end up with a situation where banks take a hit because of this whole process. So you need to recapitalize them. And you need to recapitalize them in a way in which it's not taxes on ordinary people, but taxes on the wealthy, which actually provides the finance to recapitalize the banking system, because you cannot let banks, die, because that's systemic. Finally, just a thing on the green bonds. There are many versions of it. There's debt for nature, there's green bonds, and so most of it is loans. I mean, they're not. I mean, the only thing which you can say is that given the kind of projects which are involved, in particular, if we include among green bonds spending on adaptation, which is quite crucial for smaller developing countries, it's not merely, your role in mitigation is not going to be all that great, then you're talking about projects in which the rate of return is very low or near zero. So it has to be concessional finance, preferably grants, but in practice now, a lot of these are actually being provided at credit at interest rates which are near commercial market rates. But that's not really going to help in terms of actually financing green projects, because green projects tend to be, other than for solar and so on. Solar, you can make a return. You actually have low returns. So therefore, it has to be concessional and grants. And if that comes, then debt for nature can help and can play a role. But even if that happens, there is finally the question of, is this greenwashing? Because you can claim that this is going to have all these green effects, but there has to be a monitoring agency which in some sense monitors and ensures that the claims which are being made, I mean, if you read today's paper, I mean, in the Financial Times and so on, there's this big firm whose principal business is to try and generate, carbon credits by forestation in Africa and so on. They found that most of it is complete nonsense, that none of those benefits are going to come. So there must be a way of tracking that and monitoring it.
So we'll go for another 20 minutes. So, and as you think of more questions, I just want to add a couple points relating what the panelists have said to Sri Lanka. So while the IMF, its original mandate was balance of payment support, it has creeped into, deciding what our fiscal policy should be or the constraints that are there. So this time, what they've said is that there's $3 billion over 4 years from the IMF and linked to another 3.75 billion US dollars from the World Bank and Asian Development Bank over the next 4 years. Right? So that amounts to about 1.7 billion US dollars a year, which is for budgetary support. And with that, they're saying, okay, now you have to make sure you have a primary surplus. And then, they are congratulating themselves that they've, given that they want Sri Lanka to allocate 0.6% to 0.7% of GDP for social protection. Now, there was a question, I think, from Amra about what this 0.6% means, or in this year's numbers, it's 187 billion rupees. Right? And you can figure it out. Our military budget for this year is, I think, and the security sector budget, military and police, is about 550 billion rupees, I think, if I remember correctly. I did a back of the envelope calculation in one of my columns, and I said, if each family, if you have the question is also, do we then, they say, you can just target, just give it to a few people who are desperately in need, even though it's clear that a third to possibly a half our population is now dropping into poverty in terms of the World Bank's poverty numbers. But they just want to say, you can target, narrow it. But if you think of it in universal terms, which is what Sri Lanka has had, which is what we had in the 1970s, a universal rice subsidy, 1 kilogram per individual per week, we would need about 200 billion rupees just to give the rice subsidy that we did have in the 1970s, when people are starving now, and if we are to give that today. The UNICEF recommendation for education, which was the big struggle about a decade ago, is 6% of GDP just for education. Now Sri Lanka, we spend about, I think, close to 1% of GDP in education, abysmally low. In 1970, we actually reached 5% of GDP for education. So to give you a sense of what this 0.6% for social protection amidst the worst crisis the country is facing. Now, Swastika's question about civil society, I mean, we have to, I think, in Sri Lanka really ask, because we hear the term civil society being thrown around. Who is civil society? Is it the three most prominent, well-funded NGOs in Colombo? Are they civil society? And is what they say meant to be civil society? Or is civil society the broad section of people and member organizations like trade unions, cooperatives, that is civil society? I think we need to have a debate on who is civil society, who is representing whom, and I think some issues will bring clarity to that. If in this kind of a crisis where inequalities have risen so much and we want redistribution, what is the position that these various kinds of civil society are taking, for example, on the issue of a wealth tax, which is the main form of possibility for considerable redistribution. And I think if you look at what positions organizations are taking on that, that would give some, who is taking what position. And I think the class question has to be brought out to be able to understand. There was also a question about what does a new financial architecture look like. The last 45 years since in Sri Lanka, what we call the turn towards open economy, or globally, the neoliberal turn, what we've seen is repeated crises and deepening crises. The Latin American crisis of the 1980s, the East Asian crisis of 1997, crisis in Russia, the long-term capital management hedge fund collapse and the crisis it caused. I mean, 23 years ago, the new financial architecture was shown as Humpty Dumpty, right? With its head broken already. But there hasn't been any change. We are continuing in the same financial architecture dominated by private capital, which is, so we need to change that. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. But what we've seen is that every crisis, so then when the East Asian crisis happened, they said, oh, it's crony capitalism. Or I guess now Sri Lanka, it's corrupt capitalism. But they didn't have that answer when the North Atlantic crisis happened in 2008. Somehow that was not crony capitalism. So we need to, now I think after this 4.5 decades of experience, we really need to think about what kind of a global system we want. Are we just going to keep pushing countries further and further into crisis? And after each crisis, the inequalities also drastically increase. So we'll take a few more questions and we'll try to bring this panel to an end, this event to an end in about 15 minutes. So a few questions. Shiran, we'll start with Shiran over there.
Hi, my question for the panel is, so aside from the austerity and the privatizations, a key part of the current IMF program is the question of this independent central bank. And we have a new monetary law bill that's in the pipeline. And from a brief amount of research, it seems that this has been part of IMF packages around the world, including in parts of Africa and Latin America. I just want to get the panel's opinion on what this actually entails, because this seems to be part of the package that it's not as palpable and tangible as austerity and privatization, so there's not as much debate on it. As I understand it, a key feature will be the limiting of the central bank to buy government securities so that the government cannot run a budget deficit in a case of a crisis. And then the other aspect is that there would actually be a quantitative restriction on liquidity to the banking sector. Now, the second part of my question is that if we indeed do go to domestic restructuring, plus we have this quantitative restriction on liquidity, that sounds to me like a recipe for disaster. So just general thoughts from the panel. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kanishka here. Apart from all this economic and what banks are doing, do we have to do something about the ethnic unity also? Because we have suffered for a long time, and we have suffered for a long time due to the ethnic conflict in the country. So do we have to do anything regard to the ethnic unity also? Because after all, another war or another conflict might collapse all these efforts, what we are doing, all these economic efforts. So what we shall to do that?
Talking about the global banks possibly collapsing, and with all these talks about the possibility of countries going away from the US dollar, going away from the petrodollar and forming some other currency, and a lot of countries now dumping their US bonds because the US restrictions that they have placed in retaliation to that, and what impact that might have on Sri Lanka. Do you have any comments on that?
Any other questions? This is the final round, and then who's going first? Charles, you want to go first?
I would like to just take one point about the conditionality on the on the central bank, independence of the central bank. I think as another template issue, creating constraints on the central bank in order to channel monetary policy into inflation reduction. And many countries have done it differently and have different experiences. So in my own country, they initially imposed a ceiling on central bank's ability, the amount of government securities it could finance. Before that, the central bank's role, one of its role, was to help with counter-cyclical spending. So but also to smooth government spending. So, because there's always a lag between when you're able to raise taxes when they come into the treasury and government financing obligations. So there was a very flexible process which was then netted out at the end of the year. So that was stopped, and so ceiling was placed at 5%. The banking law was adjusted. So the party that promoted this very heavily, limiting the central bank's role in financing government expenditure, when they came into government, after 2 years of experience, not only did they reduce, ease that, they actually totally violated it, because it was impossible to go by the rule that they set by themselves, because part of government fiscal problems are also as a result of these external shocks. So it became clear that it's not an effective instrument either for managing inflation or controlling government expenditure generally. But it is a template, and it will be reinforced. It's part of the ideological debate as to what the role of the central bank is. Is the central bank's role simply about inflation, or is the central bank's role also about economic growth? I mean, the American treasury system, a balance of inflation and growth. That's would define what the levels of flexibility for a central bank is. In the case of the IMF, it is focused on inflation. And so it's not surprising, I haven't looked at it in the case of Sri Lanka, but they would try to constrain the central bank even further.
Yeah, if I may add to this central bank independence, I mean, there's a political economy to it, and which is the following: that you see, in the old days, you basically could have the finance ministry picking up a telephone, calling the central bank governor or deputy governor or whatever it is, and said that, listen, I'm sending over some treasury bills. Please put some money into my account, which basically means you print money and put it into the account of the government such that it can undertake expenditures. Now, this has multiple implications from the point of view of the private sector and finance. One is, in that kind of a world where because there's finally all central banks, the appointment of central bank governors and deputy governors is undertaken by the government. So the central bank is never politically, in any sense, in a managerial sense, independent of the government. So you really don't want the government to have the right to be able to actually borrow on demand against treasury bills money from the central bank. Now, why don't you want it? First, because of the fact that in systems of that kind, the rate of interest on borrowing from the central bank is much lower than the market rate of interest. So, I mean, for example, at the time when we were not pushing for an independent central bank in India, it used to be 4.6% if you borrowed from the central bank, and if you went to the market, it used to be 7.5%. That is the government going to market, okay? So the first thing is, you basically are saying that this is a way in which the government is administering an interest rate as opposed to letting the market determine the interest rate. And the market determining the interest rate is not demand and supply for money. Because of the fact that if the demand and supply for money determine the interest rate, then we would not be woken up every time the Monetary Policy Committee, either of the Federal Reserve or of any central bank in the world meets. Will they raise interest rates? Will they reduce interest rates? And obviously, if they are going to raise or reduce interest rates, it means the market is not determining the interest rate. What the market does is it actually uses monopoly power to influence the structure of interest rates. Given policy rates, what's going to be the rest of the interest rates in the market? So you actually can change the difference between the treasury bill rate and the open market rate, and the greater the spread, it depends on who's the borrower and who's the lender. There would be Ronthia Capital would get some benefits. So the first thing is, finance doesn't like the state to intervene and regulate the interest rate. And one way in which it can regulate the interest rate is actually trying to say that I must have the right to borrow on demand from the central bank at a lower rate of interest, and that's a completely administered interest rate. The second is, that actually goes against the ability to prescribe limits on fiscal spending. Because if the government can borrow like this, now if the government does that, if it actually borrows, you're saying that there is an autonomous player who can actually decide that I want to undertake the following expenditures, borrow money, significant amount from the central bank, rather than actually going to the market, where it might actually find that when it goes to the market is not responding properly, interest rates are going up, etc. And if it borrows substantial amounts of money, it also has the right, unlike a household, to be able to tax and repay that. So a large amount of borrowing built today would mean that tomorrow, the likelihood that the government would actually go in for taxing in order to be able to generate the revenues to meet its debt in rupees. This is not external debt. So you basically have the fear that there would be an effect on, higher income earners and wealth holders in terms of a government which is excessively indebted because of the fact that it exercised its right to borrow from the central bank, to tax in order to be able to generate the revenues to repay whoever it borrows from, including the central bank. So it's in this double sense, as opposed to purely monetary policy. Finally, can in a world of open capital accounts, can an central bank be independent as opposed to being independent from the government? Because let us say suddenly there's a large inflow of capital from abroad. It'll result in a situation in which you'd have an appreciation of your domestic currency. Appreciation of domestic currency means your exports become, uncompetitive, because it basically would mean that the dollar value of your exports go up because your currency is appreciating. So the central bank is forced to intervene in order to be able to actually, stabilize the exchange rate. Which means what? It would actually buy dollars and put it into its reserves. Now, what is reserves? That's the asset position of the central bank. So if you're accumulating reserves, the liabilities of the central bank in double entry bookkeeping must go up. And what is the liability of the central bank? That's money supply. So if you have a sudden inflow, it could be the other way around, but if you have a sudden inflow of foreign capital, you would actually have a situation where the central bank is forced to intervene to stabilize the interest rate, because exchange rate management is a crucial role of central banks. That increases the reserves of foreign exchange reserves of the central bank, and that affects money supply, not because it's determining where the money supply should go, because it just is forced to actually increase money supply because its reserves are going up. So you are never independent of financial flows as a central bank. You can only claim to be independent of the government, and that is in terms of the ability of the government to borrow on demand.
I didn't quite catch the first two questions very clearly, but I think they've answered that. The last question, I understood that you are asking about the dumping of US Treasury bills, whether it would affect other countries, right? Other banks, the rest of the world. In the case of Australia. Well, that's a very big question, but we know that the strong dollar policy, which has been pursued for quite a while now, and the exchange rate of dollar is climbing up, and in the world, the largest holder of US Treasury bills as foreign exchange reserve include China and Japan and a few others. Of course, in the past, when the US dollar devalued dramatically, for instance, China was worried there would be kind of debasement of the dollar, which means that their exchange reserve would evaporate by a large percentage. Of course, right now, when the dollar is at almost at the peak, it will be natural that these countries would not, let's use the word dump or whatever, let's use the word dump for convenience, dump the treasury bills. I think is a kind of operation that central bank would do naturally for economic reasons. Of course, there is also the geopolitical part of it. How much is due to geopolitics, we cannot say. And also the actual composition of countries' foreign exchange reserve for quite a number of countries. They are top secret, we don't really know. However, by doing so, the US, their way of using their exorbitant privilege of being a dominant reserve currency for the world, that would be affected to a certain extent. So how much the US will continue to have their fiscal deficits at the same margin, we are not sure. So that would certainly, being since they are reserve currency, certainly it would affect many other countries, including Sri Lanka. But to what extent, that we would need to have a more detailed study of that, and also modeling and a lot of other things. We cannot, I cannot, of course, probably Chandra can, I cannot answer this kind of precise question on the spot. Okay. Thank you.
I just want to say a couple things on the central bank and then also the ethnic question. So I think this whole new central bank act, or what's there in this IMF agreement, is, you know, continuing with the free market regime. This sort of faith in the market. 6-7 years ago, when many of us were involved in a big campaign against predatory microfinance, and we calculated and showed that these rural women were being targeted by microfinance schemes charging 240% interest. And when I spoke to a very senior central bank official, he said, no, we can't put an interest rate cap because the IMF won't like it, because that's interfering in the market, right? 240% interest, and the market is working. In the IMF report this time, they again say, you know, you have to avoid market distortions and therefore no deficit spending, deficit financing. So they're putting a straitjacket on the economy. The only thing that they want us to target is inflation, even as the economy is completely collapsing. In our consultations the last couple of days, you know, we said, I mean, there's, you know, we really need to explore, think outside of this box. Is there even a development role for the central bank or not? These kinds of discussions have to happen if we are going through such a serious crisis. We can't surrender everything to the IMF. People talk about the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act and the constraints it places. Let's look at, you know, we knew how extractive sovereign bonds were, and the sovereign bonds were being floated by a regime that claimed to safeguard sovereignty in this country. In 2007, when the Rajapaksa regime fought a civil war claiming to safeguard sovereignty, they started floating sovereign bonds, then they accelerated floating sovereign bonds, then the good governance government also floated 12 billion US dollars in sovereign bond, all while talking about sovereignty. And now we've defaulted because of the debt crisis, and we are being told by the IMF that you should float $1.5 billion in sovereign bonds in 2028. That's the deliverance, right? Shouldn't there be some kind of process where democratically, either by parliament and so on, that at least that people are, it's being made clear to people that we're going back to this commercial borrowing and the risks attached to it. The issue with the, you know, how I see the ethnic question playing out in all of this, you know, now there's a very common term called an IMF riot, right? When you bring about so much austerity in a country, it leads to protests, sometimes riots. But we know from the history of our country that when that happens, xenophobic forces, forces that are nationalist, anti-minority, also use that to divide people. And that danger is there in the next few years. So I think even as we are talking about democratizing this process, thinking about how we are going to get people's participation, I think that is also important so that our people know how this can also be, you know, deflected. While the wealthy in this country are gaining constantly from even out of the crisis, but it's used to polarize people. That's the solution that becomes the fix. We saw this happening the last time we had such significant IMF agreements. We've had, this is our 17th IMF agreement. In 1977, 1978, we went through structural adjustment. I would argue this is even more significant than that. And I think that it's no coincidence that 6 years later, we also ended up in a civil war in terms of the social impact and the way in which then it was deflected. So there are real dangers in front of us, which are not just limited to the economic concerns, but politically and socially, that we have to be very aware that out of this process, while the IMF agreement claims that we can go back to 2018, somehow business as normal, I don't see it that way. I think if the people in this country take this seriously and try to change course, we can slowly start building a progressive society, and progressive not just in class terms, but in ethnic terms as well, in terms of the minorities, the various identities people have. Or we can end up in a more polarized and even fascist direction in the years ahead. And that is what is at stake for us. And for that, we really have to dig into all these questions that we are thinking about. So again, I think it's time to bring the discussion to an end. I really want to thank our three panelists, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, Dr. Charles Abu Ghraib, and Ms. Yu Fen Lee. I mean, for them to come to Sri Lanka, spend these last few days engaging with all of us, educating us. I've learned so much. I'm sure the last 2 days, others have also learned so much. But it's a beginning, and we hope that we can continue to work. I think what was really encouraging this time was the link and the ties we've made with Ghana and some of the African panelists, and the amount of learning we've got, because we're always westward looking, and we don't look at the countries in the global south from whom we can learn more, and there's more room for solidarity. So it's been a great experience. So I want to really thank the Ideas Network for bringing us together, and Law and Society Trust for taking up the challenge, and particularly Sandun and his team, and then the Young Researchers Network, who did all the grunt work of organizing so these discussions can happen. And we hope that a lot of these proceedings will come out soon, and that we can continue with the discussions. And thanks to all of you on a Saturday to come and spend your time and listen and engage. Thank you very much.